Maybe we could go to Dominic first and
today.
how you got started with oral history.
Look, I've been involved with the oral history group since its outset in the early 90s, because around that time I was actually between film laboratories and freelancing, doing whatever I could. And I think it was Jock Given at the Australian Film Commission at the time hired me to do a report on the effects of changing technology in the film industry. I'm not answering question 2, I'm still on how I got started. So I did that by talking to half a dozen people that I knew in the industry about how exactly that question, not their lives, not their sort of full oral history, but how their journey through technology. And I spoke to people like Harold Buse, who was then retired from his managing role at Cinesound Movietone News. He was an editor. I spoke to people like Chris Noonan, who was in the throes of making the film Babe, which obviously used a lot of modern technology or transitional technology for that, and a few other people. Those, in the fullness of time, I produced my report, but those interviews were lodged with the Film and Sound Archive. It happened that Martha Ansara found out about this somehow and invited me to come along and join the committee of or the working group of what was then the Filmmakers Oral History Group, whatever it was called, FBIOG. I guess I've gone on from there. To be honest, I haven't done an awful lot of interviews since then. I did interview some people. I was asked by the outgoing, then I guess, managing director of Atlab, Alaric McCausland, to interview, this is after I'd left there, to interview the 4 remaining film processing staff on the last day of any machine processing film in Australia. It turned out that they had all been in the industry doing more or less what they were doing, processing negative film, since we had all started in the mid-70s. So those are recordings that haven't gone to the archive. They're lodged, I hope, with Atlab or with Deluxe, who are now the owners. But I've got copies of those. So really that's sort of my story from there to then. I've remained involved with the group because once I get on a committee or a working group like that, I cannot resist staying around and
so they have to shoot you, eh, Dominic? So Rod, thank you very much. Rodney.
I think my first interest in oral history was actually through a book, which was by Studs Terkel. It was called Hard Times, An Oral History of the Great Depression. And I would have read that in my early 20s and was particularly struck, having been interested in history, but this is not history as told by an academic or a historian. This was a different kind of history where the actual participants in the Depression got to talk about all the details of their lives. And it was black and white, rich and poor, powerful and powerless people. And I was fascinated. And in a way, it was a sort of a documentary, a raw documentary book. And that was my first encounter with the term oral history. Many years later, I worked on a lot of documentaries and different films, but I'd say my first pure, serious oral history undertaking was very personal. In 1997, I set off to go to Vilnius in Lithuania with a Russian-speaking cinematographer friend, and I had been aware of the existence of my 93-year-old great uncle. His name was Chatzkel Lemkin, and he was still alive, and in a way the last leaf on our family tree in Europe. So we had been a family of migrants, and he was the one who stayed. So my mission was to go and record to the best possible quality on video. Technologically, it was Betacam SP was state of the art in 1997. And when we got there, we hired a Lithuanian sound recordist. And I wanted to make sure that this was of archival quality. I think the significant thing about that for me was that it was a personal connection. He was someone I never imagined I would meet. And we set out, he understood what my task was, and we set out to record his memories. Now, I went there with not much of a sense that, well, I just didn't know what he would remember. He was 93. I thought it wouldn't amount to much. But whatever we recorded would be better than what we had, which was nothing. We didn't know anything about that family background and his experiences. So we set up in his front room. He had a workspace and there was natural light coming through the window. And that was his comfortable spot. It was his desk where he did all his work. He was a lexicographer, a writer of dictionaries, and a philologist and a linguist. So we surrounded him with he was surrounded by his books, and we started recording. The tricky thing was that although he spoke some English, being a linguist, he preferred Lithuanian, Russian, or Yiddish, and I had none of those. So I arranged for a woman who knew him well to sit just behind me. So I was seated here, the camera was here, she was behind me. I would ask Uncle Khatskal the question. He would respond, sometimes short answer, sometimes go on for some minutes. And then the woman sitting behind me would kind of just say, Uncle Khatskal said that when that happened, when the world came out, you know, he remembered this and that. Turned out that his memory was absolutely intact. So I very quickly realized that this was going to take some time, and we ended up recording some 10 hours of material over a number of days. He remembered everything from seeing Cossacks coming in to defend the country against the invading Germans in the First World War. We went through the period between the wars. He was Jewish and so suffered enormously during the Holocaust. He talked about his memories there. His two children were murdered. His parents were murdered. He emerged after the war and was reunited with his wife. They'd both been sent to separate concentration camps. He then endured 50-odd years of communism, working as a translator, and he was put to work writing Russian, Lithuanian dictionaries. And all of this knowledge that I had no idea about emerged. So I ended up with about 10 hours of material, just of him. But in the course of that, I realized that there was much more to his story than just the oral history. And so we set about filming other material, and that oral history became the spine, the skeleton of a documentary, which was called Uncle Khatskal. And that film traveled around the world to over 50 international film festivals. And to my amazement, resonated with people from cultures in Asia and South America, in all sorts of places that I never imagined would have been interested. So that taught me a lesson, various lessons. I think the first thing is to record in the best possible way that you can to the highest quality. Not to be worried too much about what the end product is going to be, but just get as much material as you possibly can. And then there was this extraordinary surprise of how this rather modest oral history, which was intended just for family, became a communication which traveled all over the world. So my first real experience was a very positive one.
Thanks, Rodney. Graham?
Yes, I got involved in oral history through several factors. One was reading and greatly admiring the interview material that Kevin Brownlow had woven into his wonderful and magisterial work, The Parade's Gone By, which was about the history of silent cinema, primarily in America, where he'd, in the 1960s, gone back and interviewed quite a lot of people, stars, directors, writers, editors who'd contributed to the American silent cinema in the 1910s and 20s. I was also aware that people in Australia like Alan Anderson and Joan Long had started to do interviews with film pioneers as part of their work on the documentaries, The Pictures That Moved and The Passionate Industry. Although Alan intended some of his interviews to go into the Pictures Move, they weren't ultimately included. But the film records and the audio records of those interviews still survive. And I met these people in the early 70s and was quite inspired by what they told me about interviewing people. I also became quite interested in recording the story of Norman Dawn, who was an American special effects pioneer who worked in Australia on 3 feature films in the late 1920s, early 30s, for the term of his natural life, which had the biggest budget of all of them. The Adorable Outcast, which was filmed in Fiji, and Showgirl's Luck, which was one of the very first full talkie sound films made in Australia. Ray Edmondson from the National Library Film Division, preceding National Film and Sound Archive days, put me on to Norman Dawn. He gave me his contact address and I wrote to him, and I developed this wonderful pen friendship with Norman Dawn, which ran from about 1971 up until 1978 when Dawn passed away. I visited the US in 1972 and interviewed Dawn, which was quite a frustrating experience actually, because he said to me, he'd encouraged me to go over there and record the interview. He said, look, nobody's recorded an interview with me to date, come over and we'll do this. And I got over there to find him in a somewhat distracted state, because his wife, Catherine Dawn, who'd been an actress and who'd worked with him on his films as an editor in the silent period and early sound period, she'd become quite ill. And so he was a carer to her. And so I recorded what I thought was a wonderful oral history in frustrating short bursts, where he'd arrive at the motel where I was staying in Santa Monica. We'd record half to 3/4 of an hour and then he'd charge off again because, the wife needed him, to help in whatever way was needed. And I met a couple of people over there who said, look, you've got all this spare time, why don't you interview other special effects pioneers while you're here? And so it was just a matter of either being referred by these people, who are a mixture of technicians that I met, editors that I met, and academics, who suggested people who could be interviewed. So it was a mixture of them teeing up interviews over the phone, or me teeing up interviews over the phone. And I think in every case, people were available. Most of them were retirees. There were younger people like Douglas Trumbull, who'd done the model effects on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and had just made a wonderful film called Silent Running, which I was able to see while I was over there. And his was one of the more contemporary interviews, along with one that I did with a guy called Jim Danforth. And altogether, I did just over a dozen of those special effects interviews, all in the space of a fortnight. They were career-related interviews. They were not what I'd call all-encompassing oral history interviews in terms of I didn't go into such issues as, upbringing, formative influences and so forth. But in virtually every case, I got quite a fascinating portrait of somebody's career. And several of those interviews I was able to publish in Australian magazines like Cinema Papers, which was just starting, and also a magazine called Lumiere, which was in its final stages at that point. And from there on in, as a result of my interest in Australian film history, I continued to record oral histories. The first ever interview, once again, was in conjunction with the Norman Dawn story, in terms of an interview that I recorded in August 1971 with a man called Neville Mackin, who had co-funded Showgirl's Luck for Norman Dawn and had also backed the evolution of one of the very first sound on film systems in Australia. It was neck and neck with Cinesound for a while as to which one was going to be more viable. Cinesound ended up being more viable. And from there on in, my interest and involvement in recording oral histories continued, mainly with film people, but as time has gone on, I've also interviewed people like Michael Pate, who worked in radio, television, and theatre in particular. And in more recent years, I've interviewed people who've been worked for the armed services and or had been unionists or worked for places like White Bay Power Station, etc. And so, yeah, looking at the origins of my involvement in oral history in the 1970s, it really was to record stories which otherwise were difficult to record with, you know, surviving film pioneers and some of the present day practitioners as well.
Thanks very much. So we now know why you all got started. Why is it important to record oral histories, and what are some of the ethical dilemmas you've struck in your time working on them? Maybe we could start with Rodney.
I've got an example which I think serves well to bolster the point that when oral histories are recorded, they're all potentially important. Quite often people would say, well, my story is nothing special, there's nothing significant about it, so why are you asking me? An example is a documentary that I worked on a few years ago called Once My Mother, with director Sofia Turkovits. Her mother, Helena, had an extraordinary wartime story. She was exiled from Poland and sent into a Russian gulag, walked thousands of kilometers across Russia into Persia, ended up in Africa, and finally arrived in Australia in the early 1950s as a single mother with her daughter Sophia, who is now the filmmaker. Now, Helena was a Polish refugee. She was illiterate even in her own language. She was a menial worker who worked in laundries and places like that. And you would think, well, she's not significant. Why record her oral history? When we were making the film, it was at a stage when Helena was suffering from dementia, and her memories were very cloudy and very sketchy. And to my amazement, I discovered, or Sophia discovered and remembered, that somebody had come along, I can't remember when, but it was when somebody had come along from the National Library of Australia, and they were recording oral histories of refugees, and in particular, people who had been through this sort of Soviet gulag experience. And Helen's oral history had been recorded, and it was lodged in the National Library. When I first started working on the film as a producer and also shooting some of it, I said to Sophia, well, how are we going to tell this story when she's at a stage where she barely remembers anything? It's a little snippet here and a snippet there. And she said, no, I have got access to this oral history recorded at the National Library. She also had some other 16mm footage, which she'd filmed a long time ago. But we accessed the oral history interview, and it was absolutely amazing, because this was Helena during her, I'd say she was probably in her 50s and her peak memory. The stories were amazing. We didn't have any visuals, but that became a substantial part of the documentary as narration. So we were able to move between Helena now grasping for these memories and Helena at that time, although you don't see her, we had her very, very detailed memories of everything that she'd been through. It was then our task to go and find images which would illustrate and would back up what her memories were. But we just thanked the person who had had the foresight and the courage to interview somebody who was apparently insignificant and unimportant. And that story, that documentary, traveled all around the world to over 40, 50 film festivals, won awards, and her story, and a large part of that story was that oral history, the clear part of it, also traveled and was shown in Poland. So that's when you say, what's the importance of it? You may not know at the time why it's important, but it can end up being much more significant than you could ever imagine.
Thank you. Dominic, when you interviewed your colleagues in the labs, I would imagine there hadn't been too much of that done, and there wouldn't be a record now if you hadn't got that.
Look, I guess you're right, because to me, and I'll broaden it a little bit, and I'll say in general that to me the great value of oral histories is that they do record memories, observations, narratives, and so on, much more easily, really, than and a lot that wouldn't be recorded any other way, that wouldn't be written down and haven't been written down, and maybe from the point of view of people who wouldn't otherwise be listened to. The lab is one example. So yeah, those people, probably nothing would have been recorded or reported. Just a little, I was trying to think of your other question about ethical dilemmas, and I haven't struck, I know that there can be many, I haven't struck many, but one of those lab people I interviewed, who I had been working with off and on, mostly on, since 1974 when I arrived in Australia, and was working, I guess, for several years. I was his boss. He carried on, I'd moved around a little bit. And at one stage he told me in the interview that he'd been promoted to a shift supervisor, and he'd done that for a couple of months, and then he'd stepped back just to being an ordinary worker again. And I asked him why that was, and he sort of smiled and was a bit bashful in telling me, but he said, look, at the time, the shift supervisor meant he was doing very irregular hours, and he had just taken on a second job, a moonlighting job, in order to help with the, you know, with the cost of living and so on. And he didn't want that to be known around the lab at the time. And here we were, so 25, 30 years later, and he was still a little bit shy about telling me that. You know, we've remained friends, and I until this year, we used to, a group of us used to meet and have a meal regularly. But that was just one of those things that, and I guess there would be other things that people would prefer weren't brought out, even though they want to mention it in the answer to a question. I just wanted to comment briefly and take the opposite. I agree with Rod's point completely, that things that you maybe weren't aware of or didn't think were significant, you suddenly find they're going around the world. I think at the other end of the spectrum, it's also, I've been, for some years now, I've been a bit of an amateur genealogist, researching my own family history. And I know that things that you don't get from people when they're still alive are very hard to get afterwards. You can go through official records, written records, but there is nothing like talking to people. And if you can talk to people before you know you want to talk to people, then whether it's for family history or whether it's the history of the laboratory or the way a particular person experienced change and transitioned from one end of the industry to another, all of those things, I think it is so easy to capture them without having to write them down and edit them and so on, and so valuable if you can get them later. To me, that's the big importance, the big value.
Thank you. Graham, you spent most of your career being a historian, archivist, interviewer. How have you found it? Why is it important, and how have you found it in Australia to do that?
In Australia, I guess I've mostly used oral history to record the story of the film industry, or the story of the early film industry. And when I first started to research the film industry, there was frustratingly little about the detail, the day-to-day detail of production. There were a number of, there were several histories which were general and seemed to be quite erratic and contradictory and just not substantial enough as far as I was concerned. So I used oral history to talk to the likes of Ken G. Hall, Elsa Chevelle, Cecil Holmes, Lee Robinson, and some of the early TV pioneers, people like David Carl and Colin Dean, to get a sense of how their industries, and I'm talking about, you know, when I refer to Carl and Dean, I'm referring to the television industry as well. But I was after the mortar to go between the bricks, and quite often I was between the bricks as well. Oral history, I've long regarded, I think I've regarded oral history, at least since the late 1970s, as being the next best thing to an autobiography. In some cases, it's even better than an autobiography, because depending on the interactions and the degree of honesty encouraged between interviewer and interviewee, you can quite often get things that somebody will never write about and never share with another person. A supreme example of that would be the interviews that I worked on for Michael Caulfield, who ran a project, massive project, in the early 2000s called the Australians at War Film Archive Project. And it was actually a spin-off from the Australians at War series, which he produced earlier for the ABC. And funded by the Department of Veterans Affairs, they ended up being over 2,000 interviews altogether with ex-servicemen and ex-servicewomen. They're available online. Most of these interviews, except for those covering recent conflicts, are actually available online as part of both New South Wales University and one of the defence colleges, whichever one it's associated with. But between myself and Rebecca Barry, who was my co-interviewer, she was just starting out in documentary at that time, we were co-interviewers, and Michael Caulfield's process was that one of the two of us would begin on camera. We'd go for an hour, we'd get to the end of that tape, and then we'd swap across and be interviewer. And we kept on alternating like that. And it worked out really well, because many of the stories that we were recording for the first time ever with people who'd never told their families of their involvement in conflict. A number of them were quite traumatic and taxing not only on the interviewee, but the interviewer. There were people who would get to a certain point, sometimes with the most bland general questions, such as, tell us about the role of the Salvation Army chaplain, and you'd have someone completely breaking down and going into an area of memory that you had no idea they were going to go into, but a conflict-related, wartime conflict-related piece of memory. And where the ethics of this arose was that, and I think both Rebecca Barry and myself felt the same about this, we quite often felt, did we have the right to continue the interview? We would give the interviewee the opportunity, once they burst into tears and said, look, I need a moment to recover myself, we gave them the opportunity to continue or not continue or resume on another day. And in each and every case, we were lucky, in inverted commas, in each and every case, people chose to continue on that day, on the day of the interview. But there were other teams on the Australians at War Archive Project who did have to go back a separate day for that story. And I can remember early on in the project, both myself and Rebecca having doubts that what we were doing in terms of getting people to tell their stories, we were given a list of questions and research which had been done by others. We quite often questioned whether we had the right to be putting people through such an ordeal, because it really was a bit like therapy in a way. And Michael Caulfield's response was always, yes, continue. This is of value as a record. There were a number of other things around that which I could discuss on another occasion, but if we look at the ethics of something, that would be the most extreme example that I could think of.
I was just thinking there about an ethical point which was rare. I worked on 3 series of Australian biography, which was pure oral history. We would record over 3 days. That was, Robin Hughes was the interviewer, and a researcher and myself, and then a cinematographer and sound recorders. But we would record over 3 days and end up with 12, sometimes 14 hours of material. One ethical dilemma I found where I had a little bit of doubt and a little bit of conflict in the editing room. I won't name the subject of it, but there was one particular person who Robin Hughes, who was a highly skilled interviewer and had previously produced and directed the series, thought that one person was a bit of a bullshit artist and was telling stories that exaggerated his he's standing and basically the sort of thing that might be very entertaining around a campfire, but wasn't particularly true. And she had suspicions about him and felt that he wasn't fair dinkum. And there's a dilemma right there, because it's not, when you're doing oral history, you're not recording one person and then getting someone else to reflect on that person. There's no cutting to somebody else. So we managed to work out which stories were going to be in, because of that 12 hours, I was in charge of making a half-hour program called Australian Biography for SBS. So you had to leave out most of it and compress a life into half an hour. That was probably the only time we had fairly heated discussions in the edit suite. And normally I would have just shown her the cuts and got her opinion on it. There was one other thing, which is not really ethical, but that is referring to what Graham was saying, that sometimes people would sometimes say things that they hadn't meant to say. So one particular person started talking about his first wife, and he'd left her in rather unfortunate circumstances. He'd gone off with somebody else while she was pregnant. And he started talking about that and went on for some time. And then at the end of that session said, "Oh, I don't think I should have said quite as much. Can we agree that that won't be used until I'm no longer here?" So that was our ethics were then, well, of course, if somebody says, "I don't want anybody else to hear about this until I'm gone," then you make a note, and then that's in the archives as well. That was for Film Australia. So I know that material won't be accessed. Someone would look that up, and if they wanted to see that part of it, it just wouldn't be available to the public. So there's two little issues.
That was then. Today, you would sell it to Facebook straight away.
That's right. Today, you'd say, gold.
That's right. Dominic,
wait till I hear about what's his name.
Dominic, anything else you'd like to say about ethics before we move on to technology?
I don't really have a lot to add. As I said, I've not probably not been in the more sensitive areas of interviewing and life stories that Rod and to an extent Graham have experienced. So no, I think what we've heard from Rod and Graham has summed it up pretty well from my point of view.
Okay, let's talk now about technological developments. And of course, in oral history, the major thing is you've got smaller cameras, smaller lights, smaller sound recordings. We're recording this on Zoom, whereas to do an interview on 35mm film when the film camera ran out after 10.5 minutes, 11 minutes was a totally different ballgame. Could you go back and just cover a bit of your career with technology, Dominic, and how you've seen changes going on in the industry? And this is not necessarily just about oral histories.
Well, no, I'll broaden it right out to the industry at large. And having started out as a film processing technician, need I say more? The technology is completely convoluted in my lifetime. But it's curious in a way, because I guess I became identified quite early on as a specialist, an expert, if you like, in the minutiae of processing film and film laboratories and so on, right at the sort of the technical side of, or the traditional technical side of filmmaking. But at the same time, through my career, I have been an observer and in some instances a promoter of the advancements in technology. As I mentioned, the series of interviews I did at the beginning of all of this were looking at other people's views on the way technology changed. I guess until digital filmmaking and production and exhibition came along at the beginning of the century, effectively, the technical changes in film production were probably incremental rather than revolutionary. My report for the Film Commission observed that perhaps the biggest single change was the introduction of video assist in were shooting.
What was video assist, Dominic?
Sorry, video assist is where instead of only the camera operator can see what's actually happening by appearing through the viewfinder during the take, it's coming out, feed to through video to a TV monitor of some sort that the director and the cleaner and everybody else can watch and applaud and so on. So you've got an immediate view, or the director has got a view of exactly what it's looking like. And the operator, also the other big liberating thing is that the operator doesn't have to be peering through the viewfinder. In fact, you don't need anybody with the camera, so you can then put the camera up on a crane or a jib, a lightweight one, without having somebody sort of clinging on for dear life next to it. And so it goes to the extent that now, you can have, there was a time when you had film cameras being swung on a sort of a trapeze over a football game. Until the footballers complained it looked like the ball. So they...
I've never heard that expressed before, that video assist thing of being such a major technological thing.
I actually presented that point of view to a conference in London run by the British Kinematograph Society, and David Samuelson of the famous Samuelson camera rental company worldwide was in the audience. And he stood up afterwards and thanked me very much, because it was actually his idea in the first instance.
Thank you. Rodney.
I was interested recently to be reading about how when oral history first took off. And apparently a real incentive for it was the advent of the portable tape recorder. And so until then, it really hadn't been easily feasible for somebody to just walk into somebody's house or flat and do this recording. And I can well remember my first little tape recorder with little 3-inch reels, and how we used to make radio shows and quiz shows and things when I was probably about 9 or 10, I think I was given it for a present. So that seemed to be it's interesting that was a kind of a launch for more and more oral history to be done, because until then it was in the hands of more professional people. So like the rest of you, I've seen it go from very highly technical Nagra recorders to tiny little digital recorders, and in fact the sort of material we can just record on our own phone. The question then is, what is it for? If it's a sort of a working document, and for research you can use almost anything now. If you want it to be archival, then there's a discussion to be had on what is minimal quality. But it's certainly made life easier for us. And there's now also an extraordinary thing where at the end of doing, say, my most recent experience was 3 hours of oral history interview, and then uploading that to an organization that will then deliver you a transcript of that in about half an hour later. One of them took a couple of hours, which was really tedious. But the other interview, I was amazed. I was still sitting there talking to the editor, and the 3-hour transcript came back. So it wasn't 100% accurate, but that kind of change of technology and using artificial intelligence and robots is also making our lives much easier.
Thanks. Maybe I'll lead to Graham, and this is something that AMOHG thinks is particularly important. It's all right to have an oral history or a video recording history of somebody, but if you don't have a transcript alongside that, then if researchers in the future can't find it. There's no metadata. And maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about that, Graham.
Researchers in the future can find material if they're prepared to wade through countless hours of interviews. There's a point of view in certain archives around the world that researchers prefer to come in and listen to the interviews rather than have access to a transcript. I don't subscribe to that point of view. When I was working on the Sydney Film Festival Oral History Project in the early 1990s, we had a situation where we wanted to interview one of the founders of the Sydney Film Festival, John Kingsford Smith. And I'd known John Kingsford Smith, I'd recorded an earlier interview with him, and he was terrific. And I knew that that interview had been transcribed. I hadn't recalled that he'd covered the origins of the Sydney Film Festival. When I went back, you know, circa 1992, 93 to interview him, a lot of his memory had gone. He barely remembered anything about the Sydney Film Festival, and it was unfortunately somebody who was in a state of mind where he should really have not have been interviewed in the first place. Luckily enough, I remembered the fact that I'd interviewed him in 1978. We were in a great hurry to complete that project, the Oral History Project, which was going to be published between hardcovers in time for the opening night of the Sydney Film Festival in 1993. And so I called up the transcript held by the National Film and Sound Archive of the oral history that I'd recorded with John Kingsford Smith, you know, in those earlier years. And he was there, a wonderful transcript where chapter and verse, all the detail, all the anecdotes, all the memories that we wanted, could have wanted, about the very formative years of the Sydney Film Festival were there. If I hadn't had access to that transcript, we would have bypassed that interview altogether, and there would have been a significant gulf and a gap in the account of those formative years of the Sydney Film Festival. The existence of a transcript made it possible quickly and easily I think this was the days before electronic search, but I knew that I'd recorded the interview chronologically, so it was just a matter of turning through the pages, doing a bit of speed reading and finding the sections that I wanted. Over the years, wherever possible, I've produced at least a log of the interviews. So it's, you know, quickly turning a page, you can just glance your way down the page and read through the topics. I think that's the next best thing to a transcript. And in fact, in many ways, it should be complementary to a transcript. It should be the guide to the transcript. But in most cases, if it's a lengthy interview, the absence of a transcript might mean for a lot of people who have limited time that it was probably better not to have recorded the interview in the first place, because it is still relatively inaccessible until there's a printed form on it.
Okay, so maybe we should finish up with a question without notice, and that's in these days where we can do these Zoom interviews and anybody with an iPhone can do an oral history with their next best friend and publish it immediately. What are the skills that are necessary to elicit a good oral history? Maybe we should start with Rodney.
To be a good listener, I think, is the key thing. Sometimes I would access interviews that had been done for the National Library or the National Archives for research purposes, and they were more conversations than interviews. So you would have the interviewer interjecting and even saying, that's interesting. And if you wanted to use the sound from that, it was unusable. And listening to it, I thought, well, I'm not here to listen to you. I'm actually interested in the subject. So I think that would be my first thing. Ask your question and then get out of the way.
Thank you. Dominic.
I guess do your research beforehand so you know what questions to ask and you know things that you think might be interesting that your subject might not think are interesting. I suspect that happens more often than not. People, you know, just think what they have to say about something wouldn't interest anybody else. Usually it does. And the other thing is, yes, be a good listener and be what I think Storey Walton calls the art of the unasked question, which is when your subject has finished an answer, you just, maybe you nod, maybe you look quizzically, but you say nothing for a while, and then they want to expand a little bit more, and maybe that's when you get the real answer.
I think that's a great technique. It's quite often that's when you get the bit either that you hoped you would get, or the bit that you didn't even realize was there to get, because they feel like they need to fill in the gaps. So that's a really good tip of not interjecting too quickly.
Look, I'm a great believer in research as well, either a pre-interview over the phone or a bit of a meeting to talk about things. If someone can provide you with a CV, that certainly helps. It's very rare that I haven't gone into an interview with a fair degree of preparation. I think one of the important things in an interview is not to be too tied to your questions. It's a bit like the technique that Andrew Denton employed on Enough Rope, in that he spent days studying and reading and rereading his questions, and then basically put them under his chair. I found that sometimes a list of questions can be a barrier and maybe even a little bit of an inhibitor to an oral history. But it is important to have that spine in the background, but it's also important to be prepared to go off on sidetracks if those sidetracks look potentially or actually important, or certainly potentially very rewarding. I'm a great believer in using silences as well, not butting in. I mean, I guess we've all found ourselves butting in every now and again and going, oh no, I wish I hadn't done that, particularly on playback. I think one of the best people that's ever interviewed me was Martha Ansara, who knew exactly the questions to ask and exactly when to remain silent. And she remained silent for long periods of time, which gave me the liberty to tell my story up until the point that we finished recording it. But there was something about Martha that almost kind of magnetized the answers out of me. It was a real kind of vibe that encouraged me to be more prolific than words than I normally would be. But to good effect, to good focused effect.
Thank you very much. Okay, maybe we could just come to closing remarks, and I'll go to Dominic.
Okay, I actually just wanted to ask, not Graham, but the other two of you a question. Graham says, mentioned Martha interviewing him. Have either of you two been interviewed yourself in oral histories? Rod or Malcolm?
Yes, I was actually interviewed by Malcolm.
And I was interviewed by Graham, 9 hours.
I was
and we were all great. We were all wonderful interviewers.
Perfect.
Of course, yes. I was interviewed a few years ago not by anyone here, but by Belinda Mason for the City of Sydney, who were doing a history of industries and companies and so on in the City of Sydney. So it's not so much about me, but about the story of Colorfilm. But I think it's valuable, very valuable, to have been a subject as well as, before you interviewer. That'll do as a summing up, I think, from me.
Thank you. Rodney?
I don't think I've got much more to say, except that I continue to be enthralled by oral history. I love people's life stories. I love the unexpected. I particularly like interviewing people at what I might call the latter stages of their life. In Australian biography, we set the bar at 65 and over. You didn't want to have it too late, because then, as Robin Hughes would say, they're a bit on the turn. and
thank you, Rodney.
The stories, I'm not talking about us, but at a certain point you realise that the details of the stories aren't there, or the beginning is and the end isn't. But I love the perspective that older people get, where they can look back on a whole period of their life, and it might be a first marriage in which there were 3 children, and just sum that all up in a paragraph. Oh, my first marriage had 3 children, and it didn't last, wasn't really the right thing. I was too young at the time. And then they go on to the next thing. You think, wow, imagine all those peaks and troughs of that period of their life. But they've got this perspective where they can just say, that was then, it was like this, and now move on. So I love the fact that those peaks and troughs kind of even out when you're at a distance. But as long as it's not too much of a distance where you don't remember those details. And quite often it's the emotions which come back rather than the dramatic little details. So I continue to be intrigued by people's life stories.
Thank you. Graham?
I regard oral history as a very valuable tool among many, many other things, of a very valuable way of recording stories that are otherwise not going to be recorded at all. If I think of a number of highlights, I think principally of someone like Phil Budden, who was in at the very early days of continuous printing and the running of the film laboratory in Australia, taking over from that era when silent era cameramen used to print and process their own material. So Phil Budden represented what was originally known as Bruce and Sharp, and then became Commonwealth Film Laboratories, ultimately became Colorfilm, and then eventually Atlab. That was a really unique interview in that I don't know of too many other bosses, company bosses of laboratory businesses that have been interviewed in Australian film history. And his interview was also a history of film laboratories in Australia, including the various offshoots and the takeovers and the way the business had run and the rise and fall of the business, which also reflected what was happening in the film industry more generally in Australia. The other significant interview that springs to mind is the no less than 32-hour interview I ended up recording with Dale Turnbull. And he covered 3 generations. He covered his grandfather, Charles Herschel's generation of producing so-called industrial films during the silent period. He covered his father, Ernest Turnbull's period as both managing director and chairman of Hoyts and 20th Century Fox in Australia, and Dale's own time as a junior executive with 20th Century Fox, and then ultimately running both of those companies, 20th Century Fox and Hoyts. These to me are rare stories which you're not otherwise going to see too much of, and I think that's where oral history can really shine.
Thank you very much to you all for your contribution. I'll just finish with, on a technological note, and that was in 1895, as we all know, the Lumiere brothers invented the cinematograph, which was a camera, a developing box and a projector all in one. And they famously said, this industry has no future. I think we should leave it there. Thank you very much.